forgiven.
Let's speak more about the war with Michael O'Hanlon from Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution and Rajan Menon. He's the director of the Grand Strategy Program at Defense Priorities. Good evening to you both. Thank you very much for joining us on our program. Michael, I'll start with you. What do you think these strikes tell us about Russia's strategy right now?
Well, at one level, they are just more of the same, of course, and it's a strategy that was attempted over the winter primarily and failed. If the goal was really to break Ukrainian will or somehow make the world feel that Putin could just keep turning up the pain, turning up the volume, and he'd always have some new trick up his sleeve. Because even though those missile and drone attacks through the winter were deadly, Ukraine showed its resolve and its mettle in soldiering on, both literally on the battlefield and also in its civilian life, its economy, its cities, the will of its people. On the other hand, Russia's trying to make sure that we don't ever get too complacent about where this war stands. And if it weren't for these kinds of Russian attacks or Russia threatening to not renew the grain deal that allows for the world, food markets to be benefiting from Russian and Ukrainian exports, or other things that Russia continues to do to throw in a monkey wrench, then Moscow might feel like the narrative was being lost, that we were all just worrying and thinking about Ukraine's spring offensive, thinking that somehow momentum is on Ukraine's side. And I think Putin just wants to remind us, no, he's already got, and he's always got, more things he can do to make life complicated, to make life difficult and even deadly for Ukrainians and others. So it's Putin staying relevant. It's not a big deal. It's not going to change the course of anything, but he's preventing anything else from having a narrative of sort of positivity in regard to Ukraine.
Rajan, what do you think? Is this indeed about the narrative here and Putin taking control of that again?
I think it's an attempt to break Ukrainian morale. And as Mike pointed out, it's done exactly the opposite. I've been to all of the towns that were hit or nearly hit today, except for Uman. And every time there are such attacks, there are air raids, and Ukrainians by and large have gotten inured to this, by the way, because you can't be in Ukraine and hear these air raids, be paralyzed by fear all the time. I don't think they're very much military consequence. What we have to look to see whether the battle lines move is the upcoming Ukrainian offensive, which I think will be primarily launched from the south. I'll add one other thing. It is true that these attacks are not of direct military consequence, but they do add to the colossal damage that Ukraine has suffered. And the estimates range for reconstruction between $444 billion, that's the World Bank, and $750, which is the Ukrainian Finance Ministry's estimate.
Rajan, you mentioned that impending Ukrainian counteroffensive that we are expecting. Looking at where things stand right now, do you think that Ukraine is in the position to make a breakthrough?
They have about 9 brigades that have been trained up by the West. That's roughly between 35 and 40,000 people. The West has supplied a good bit of the arms that it promised. Ukraine has something like now from the West about 1,500 additional armored vehicles, infantry fighting vehicles, and armored personnel carriers, about 230 tanks, artillery of various sorts, mine clearing equipment, air defense systems. So they are ready to go. The reason I think it will be in the south is the way I read the battlefield. I think they will attack from 2 axes, from Kherson province and Zaporizhia province into the Russian-held regions of those 2 provinces and try to cut the land bridge that the Russians have built to Crimea. If they succeed, and that's a big if, the Russians will be in some significant difficulty. So far, mind you, most of the action has taken place in the Donbass, which consists of 2 Ukrainian provinces, Lugansk and Donetsk. But the center of gravity, I think, will shift come the spring offensive and when the ground hardens.
Okay, and Mike, do you also see this as a possible turning point?
Well, I think that's great military analysis, and I can't do any better than that or propose a better battle plan. But of course, we're all talking about these Ukrainian battle plans in the open, and the Russians obviously are part of the conversation. They know what's going to be attempted. And I don't think that Ukraine is likely to achieve major breakthroughs. There's a possibility that at some point the so-called land bridge from Russia all the way over to Crimea is severed, but Russia's already supplied Crimea for 8 years without having a land bridge, and my guess is they could continue to do so now. So what I'm expecting, and I hope I'm wrong, is that Ukraine will make modest, but only modest, gains in its spring offensive, and that Russia, having been fortified by this mobilization that Putin carried out, having a lot of trench lines, having some anti-tank weapons, will perhaps be able to limit just how far and how deeply Ukraine can penetrate with these 9 brigades. On the other hand, 9 brigades is not a trivial force, and if they really can do fantastic combined arms maneuver, even without much of an air force, who knows? But my money is in favor of predicting a relatively modest set of gains for Ukraine this spring.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit, Mike, because I want to ask you about what we saw in the leaked Pentagon documents, which was Washington expressing some concerns about Ukraine's ability to continue to counter Russia's attacks, concerns about Ukraine's air defenses as well. Publicly, Washington says it is standing behind Ukraine for as long as it takes. Do you think, however, that behind closed doors, that narrative, aside from, of course, dissenting Republican voices, but in the White House, that narrative could change?
Yes, but not necessarily in a complete 180-degree fashion. I don't think there are even many Republicans, and certainly not many in the Biden administration, who would somehow leave Ukraine high and dry and just cut off assistance altogether. I think the more likely dynamic here is after we've seen this spring offensive, we'll take stock of what we think is militarily and strategically realistic for the next round of fighting and start to have some tough conversations with Ukrainians about whether they have to lower their ambitions a bit, not to concede territory to Russia per se, but perhaps to have a negotiation or at least a ceasefire where they acknowledge they're not going to get all their land back now. And maybe they need a 10, 20, 30-year time horizon where some of that land could perhaps be recovered through referenda. Some of it has to outwait Putin's stay in the Kremlin. Some of it may just have to await a fundamental change in Russian politics. And in the meantime, you make the best you can with the 90% or 85% of the country you still hold. I think those kinds of debates and conversations may well happen later this year.
Very interesting. Rajan, I want to hear what you think about that as well. Do you think the spring offensive could be indeed very significant in how the Biden administration sees this war going forward?
The answer is yes. I mean, I'd come back for a moment to the land bridge issue. It's not just a matter of the difficulty of supplying Crimea. It is very important, actually, for supplying Crimea because the Kerch Strait Bridge is not going to be operational again until July. So the land bridge is important. The point of severing the land bridge, if, and this is a big if the Ukrainians succeed, is to split the Russian forces in the southern theater. Now, if the offensive succeeds, there will be enormous pressure on the West to keep the momentum going. On the other hand, if the Ukrainians suffer a reverse, and I'm not saying that they will, then there will be a decision point where we ask ourselves, how much more do we pump into Ukraine to help them succeed? I am on balance optimistic because the performance of the Russian army has been some amalgam of brutal and completely incompetent. And morale is on the Ukrainian side because they are defending their own country.
Okay, and I'm going to ask you both one last question, and it's very unfair of me, but ask you to answer it in about 15 to 20 seconds each. So, Rajan, I'll start with you. What do you make of the call between President Xi and President Zelensky this week? Does that change at all, you think, China's perspective on its involvement in this conflict?
If you read the Chinese peace plan, it calls for a ceasefire. Some people have interpreted that to mean that Xi Jinping wants the existing battle lines frozen in place. But what the Chinese have said is ultimately there should be a ceasefire. They have said nothing at all about the ultimate disposition of territory. Now, can he pull it off remains to be seen. The two sides are very far apart in terms of what they regard as a minimally acceptable settlement.
Okay, and Mike, your thoughts very quickly?
Very quickly, yes, we should hope that China can be helpful here. They've been too friendly to Putin. We all know that, but we should not give up on the Chinese potentially playing some modestly useful role. And their peace plan is not so bad if you actually look at it and think about it, calmly and fairly. So I think the Western reaction to have been so negative and so categorical was a mistake.
Very interesting perspectives there. Michael O'Hanlon, Rajan Menon, great to have you both on the program. Thank you.
Thank you.